G'day and welcome back to Reality Check. Hard on the heels of the third tranche of UFO files, I'm delighted to have today with me Jonathan Caplan KC. He's a leading barrister, a King's Counsel. He's practiced for over 50 years and he's acted in some of Britain's most interesting legal cases. The rogue trader frauds of Nick Leeson, who took Baring's Bank for $1.4 billion, media baron Robert Maxwell's pension scandal fraud, the Leveson inquiry into the British press's scandalous conduct, the phone hacking scandal, corporate misfeasance and naughty media. He's your man. He's been at the centre of sensitive, high-stakes litigation with significant international attention, and he's regularly ranked in the top tier of British lawyers in his specialist fields. His legal work underlines just how rigorously Jonathan Caplan emphasises forensic evaluation of evidence. So by any measure, Mr. Caplan is a careful and measured assessor of the truth. So why is he writing a book on this crazy UFO subject? For in addition to his prestigious legal career, John is the author of the 2026 book just out, Not for Disclosure, UFOs, the World's Best Kept Secret, which is published just this week by Century Penguin. He has researched UAPs for over 50 years and applies his forensic legal skills to evaluate evidence from scientific, intelligence and military sources. And he's previously served on the editorial board of a leading international UFO journal. John Caplan, welcome to Reality Check. It's great to have you here.
Well, thank you very much, Ross, and I'm delighted to be with you from London.
So tell me, sir, why are you interested in UFOs? What twigged your interest? How early did you get engaged down the rabbit hole?
Well, my interest goes back, I'm afraid, to the early 1970s, and I saw an item on a television program here about a flying saucer following a passenger plane, which piqued my interest. And after that, I began to look for information on this subject to see what I could find. There wasn't a lot in those days. And I ended up joining the board of an international magazine called Flying Saucer Review, which I think at the time was the leading magazine in this subject. We had correspondents such as Jacques Vallée and many other leading ufologists who supplied material for the magazine. One of my jobs was to deliver each copy to the equerry of Prince Philip, who was interested in the subject. And I met through the editors, who were Gordon Crichton, Charles Bowen, many of the leading researchers at the time. And then as my interest became known, I managed to meet people who were in official positions. I've done some work for government agencies. And I think perhaps because of my profession, I earned their trust and they were prepared to confide in me, perhaps in ways they would not otherwise have done.
So have you ever had a conversation with anybody in the British government who's admitted that they know a hell of a lot more than the British government cares to publicly admit about UFOs?
So the conversations I've had with politicians and people in the principal intelligence services, by that I mean MI6 and MI5, haven't yielded much at all. And in fact, a former senior officer of MI6 told me that this subject had never crossed his desk. And I believe that's the case because I think that we don't have a budget. Most countries don't have a budget for this topic. And it is kept, I think, very much outside of the principal powers, the US, Russia, and China, within small departments of the Department of Defense, whose principal interest is national security and ensuring that there is no threat to our airspace or our oceans. And they rely a lot on the Americans to provide what they will.
What's the most celebrated UK UAP case that you think is worthy of public attention?
I think there's been a few. I mean, I think Rendlesham was an interesting case. I think we've had cases where we've had craft over nuclear facilities. There obviously have been reported abductions here. So I think pretty much the normal span of UFO cases that you get internationally.
One of the things I've come across in my time is Australian Special Forces guys who've told me they were on secondment to 22 Hereford, the British SAS regiment, and they incidentally found themselves dispatched for what was apparently, they're not sure because they're not quite sure what they were retrieving, it was a retrieval. Are you aware of allegations of British Special Forces being involved in retrievals of non-human craft or suspected exotic technology?
I'm aware of that having been alleged, and I'm aware possibly of one individual who I think may well have been on such a mission, but I don't have any direct knowledge. Obviously, the Special Forces are under the direction of the Prime Minister, and they are detached for special missions. And it may well be that has happened. I don't discount it, but I haven't got direct evidence.
Look, while I'm here, I didn't ask you ahead of time about this, but I thought I'd throw this at you anyway and see whether it pushes your buttons. There is the most extraordinary video that's done the rounds for a while online, and it's at a place called Goodwood Aerodrome, and it purportedly features non-human beings on a long-range video meeting humans. And obviously the implication is that it's some kind of exchange of apparently a dead being with British authorities. Are you aware of this video? It's long circulated on the internet. And to me, I've heard rumours about Goodwood, and I've just wondered whether it came across your desk at all in your time at Flying Saucer Review.
I'm afraid it hasn't actually, no. But now you mentioned it, Ross, I will.
I'll send you the link afterwards, and I think I'll post it maybe in this story. It is an intriguing one. Now, one of the things that I'm fascinated by is that Prince Philip and his equerry were very interested in UFOs, and as you say, you delivered copies of Flying Saucer Review to the Queen's husband, the Duke of Edinburgh. Did you ever get the chance to engage with him directly?
No, I haven't engaged with him directly. I've engaged with people in that circle without identifying them. But he did have an interest, a great interest. And Sir Peter Townsley, who was his equerry and a former Air Force officer, used to interview witnesses at the palace, and Prince Philip would receive reports of Peter Townsley's investigations. They did it in a way which was not attracting too much publicity, obviously, but this was something that they were both interested in, and Prince Philip was very happy to agree to.
And I think you also mentioned in the book that Lord Louis Mountbatten, who sadly was murdered by the IRA, he also took an interest.
Yes, he had an interest too. And there are rumours, I've never been able to substantiate them, that in fact a craft had landed on his estate and that it had been seen by a gardener. I've heard that from a couple of people in the employment of Louis Mountbatten, but I can't confirm it. But that's certainly a rumor.
You're way ahead of me, John. I was about to ask you about exactly the same thing. Yeah, I was going to ask whether you'd heard about the UFO that landed at Mountbatten's estate. There is a long history in the British aristocracy. I mean, I've actually been approached by people with titles in the UK who have I think, an eccentric interest in the subject, the arcane subject of UAPs, but they're all a bit shy about going public. One thing that I'm fascinated by is an account that you tell in your book where the equerry, the Duke of Edinburgh's equerry, went to visit what may have been a person that was non-human. Can you tell me that story?
Yes, it's very interesting, and he tells it in his book, Sounds from Another Room, and I've no doubt that it would not have been put into that book without Prince Philip's consent, because Peter Townsley would have never have published it otherwise. And he tells the story of being introduced to a woman called Mrs. Markham, who had a flat in Chelsea, fashionable Chelsea. And he was asked to go there by a military colleague and to meet her and somebody who was interested in possibly having some information for Prince Philip. He went, and there was a mysterious figure in the corner of the room who was introduced as Mr. Janus. And he immediately became aware that Mr. Janus was able to read his mind and was able to tell him of a number of confidential matters which were not public. And then Mr. Janus invited him to tell him what he knew about the subject of what were then called flying saucers. And he proceeded then to give him a detailed account of how another civilization had become so advanced that they were interested in developing life and sustaining life elsewhere. And he very much wanted Mr. Janus to meet Prince Philip, who he felt was a man who was attuned to nature, to animals, to the ecology of the planet. And the meeting, in fact, was to try and persuade Peter Townsley to effect that introduction. Peter Townsley left certainly, let's say, rather disquieted by the fact that he'd met somebody with who was certainly unusual. He came pretty much to the conclusion that Mr. Janus was an extraterrestrial, not somebody of this human civilization. But he obviously would have discussed it. He made a report immediately of the conversation, a contemporaneous report as soon as he left, and went back to Mrs. Markham's flat sometime later. But she was not there. The flat was empty, and he was unable to make any further contact with her. But he decided very much that he was not going to make that introduction.
That's an intriguing story. There's another one you tell in the book, and I've read this before, but it's a very senior British RAF officer, Royalist Air Force officer, who's flying his aircraft, I think, in the 1930s, and he seems to go through some kind of a portal where he sees men in coveralls and activity on an aerodrome, and it's quite inexplicable what he saw. Can you tell me that story as well? Because it's one I've heard before, and I was fascinated to see you've included it in your book.
Yes, I've included it in the book, though, Ross, because it fits into a very interesting development. Obviously, Majestic 12 is a matter of some controversy. I conclude that Majestic 12 existed and that the documents are real. And I think we can talk about that later if you wish. But one of the things I've discovered in looking at the matter further is that within 1 week of the Truman directive to Bush and James Forrestal to, in fact, set up Majestic 12 and to report directly to him, at the beginning of October 1947, Forrestal then had a meeting with Sir Henry Tizard, who at that time was the chief scientific advisor to the Ministry of Defense. And it is extremely unlikely that Forrestal did not tell Sir Henry about Majestic 12, the reason that it had been set up because of the craft that had been found and the biologics that went with it. And Sir Henry Tizard, in fact, came back to the United Kingdom and did set up a secret flying saucer working party in the Ministry of Defense. But not only that, Forrestal then had, in the month of October 1947, a number of meetings with other Air Force officers and British Ministry of Defense officials. And the only conclusion I think you can properly draw from that is that they were working to some plan and there was some design. And one of those people was Air Marshal Victor Goddard, who saw Forrestal, and I can't remember whether he saw Eisenhower as well in October. But Goddard's a very interesting individual, and he had himself some paranormal experiences. As you say, he was flying over a decommissioned airfield, which was situated at Drem. And as he came out of cloud, he saw planes and people in yellow uniforms on the ground, which was a very accurate description of that airfield. But that only happened several years later because it was decommissioned at the time he came out of the clouds. Also, another officer told Goddard that he shouldn't take a particular flight because he foresaw Goddard crashing. The flight did crash, but Goddard survived. And in his later life, Goddard began lecturing about flying saucers and gave a lecture at Caxton Hall in London where he expounded his own theories. So the connection between Forrestal, who just had this directive from Truman, meeting very speedily with Sir Henry Tizard, Air Marshal Victor Goddard and others, I think is a very significant development.
So I'm glad you mentioned MJ12 because that's where I was going with Goddard. MJ12, we've discussed this on the show before, and my viewers will know I also agree with you, Jonathan, that certainly you've got me on the first tranche of MJ12 files. I'm in no doubt whatsoever that they are authentic. I'm yet to be convinced fully that there's not what my colleague Rob was telling me earlier is called passage material, the possibility that there might have been deliberate disinformation planted in some of the subsequent MJ12 documents. But let's set the scene for our audience just so they know what we're talking about. There was a Truman directive, 24th of September, 1947, in a document that was leaked in 1980 or so to two filmmakers. And those documents became known as the Majestic 12 documents, the provenance of which is still, of course, disputed officially by the FBI and the US military. But they established, allegedly, Majestic 12 as the group responsible for the retrieval of non-human craft. It was issued at the request of Dr. Vannevar Bush and James Forrestal, the Secretary of Defense, as you've said. And I was intrigued because you mention it in your book as one of the most consistent documents in the MJ12 corpus, and you place strong emphasis on it being genuine. And of course, if it is true that the President Truman did issue a directive in 1947 establishing MJ12, it creates an incredible new alternative history that would explain a lot of the secrecy pertaining to UFOs over the last 80 years. Can you set the scene for me as to why you think these documents are authentic?
Well, I think you've got to remember when they originated. They originated virtually at the end of the Second World War, although there had been reports of crashes and indeed crashes during the Second World War itself. And that was a position of crisis for the United States and the world. And I think to be told, as these documents relate, that the president was being informed that craft had crashed, which were not of this earth, presented a new and very real threat to the United States and indeed the world. And the curtain, I think, came down. Truman was very concerned about this, as were his staff and military staff. And obviously, it was a matter that required very urgent attention. There were real concerns, technological concerns about what might be gained from it. There were concerns about whether or not there was going to be a risk of imminent attack. And there were concerns about, obviously, destabilization of the populace. But I think it's the quantity of the documents. It's not just the directive. The other documents which precede it in the 1940s and in the early 1950s, the detail, the personnel involved, when you look at them and look at their histories, they are people who, in fact, did have positions they're the type of people you would expect to be involved in these events. And I go into detail about some of them in the book. And then you see communications between Forrestal immediately after this directive with other defense chiefs and allies, such as Sir Henry Tizard and others. I think this reinforces the fact that they were presented with a crisis, and they were looking at the possibility that there might be an attack and a position of real security that needed to be dealt with. And the detail of the documents check out with contemporary diaries, which were not released at the time. The meetings that are referred to in the documents are reflected in the diaries of not just the president, but Forrestal, Eisenhower. I've looked at the diaries of the head of the Atomic Energy Commission, and it just does knit together. The only other alternative is that this is some kind of counterintelligence operation. And I think I really do discount that, because as I say, the detail checks out. They are such a quantity of these documents, many of which don't have any counterintelligence consequence at all. And I'm pretty sure that most of them, not all of them, but most of them are genuine.
Okay, let's go there for a while, because I've always been intrigued by the explanation that has been offered by the debunkers, that the documents were conceived by James Jesus Angleton, the notorious head of counterintelligence for the CIA, who, on the account that's given by the debunkers, he supposedly created these documents to disinform the Soviets into the belief that the Americans had recovered alien technology. And it never washed with me, because I can imagine creating, as you say, one document or a couple of documents or a few documents. This is a vast trove of material, and whoever conceived the documents clearly had a knowledge of names, details, events. For example, one of the things that you point out in your book is that at the time that was it Truman or Eisenhower? One of the documents you talk about, the president was actually at Blair House because the White House was being rebuilt. And I thought that was a very important detail, that whoever it was, if these were fakes, they'd gone to the detail of learning where the president was at that time. It corroborates, as you say, with the diaries of individuals. And in the first case that you cited there, the meeting with Sir Henry Tizard from the UK government, very early after the original 24th of September 1947 directive. They held a lunch, Forrestal and Bush, Vannevar Bush, held a lunch with the British scientist Sir Henry Tizard, the chief scientific advisor to the UK Ministry of Defence, on, as you say, the 1st of October 1947. They knew each other because Tizard had worked on the radar, cavity magnetron radar. And as you say, it's unlikely in the extreme that they didn't brief Tizard on the UFOs issue on Majestic. And it's interesting.
He then comes back and sets up a flying saucer working party in the Ministry of Defence.
And also you correctly note that all of this is recorded in their diaries, like you're able to corroborate that these meetings took place.
Yes, and by the way, the report which was then produced by the Ministry of Defence has these words, not precisely, but almost. Following the American lead, it is desirable that should be as little publicity as possible given to this matter, and only one copy of this report will be produced, and that will be sent to Sir Henry Tizard. So it clearly is the case that Forrestal impressed on Tizard that this had to be kept under wraps, that they should go away and do their own research, and that they should limit the documents that they're producing, possibly only for his own personal use.
Now, did you check Sir Henry Tizard's papers in the UK? Did he leave any papers? Is there any evidence that he corroborates any of this in his own personal papers?
No, hasn't been possible to do that. I've obviously managed to get a copy of the report. I did check the diary. You've mentioned the Blair House meeting. That was a meeting held in July 1949. And one of the people that was present there was the chairman of the Atomic Energy Commission, David Lilienthal. His diary is at Princeton University. And this was an off-the-record meeting. So I did manage to get access to his diary, and he refers in detail to this meeting. And there are comments such as being made by some of those present, well, this is a secret we should keep to ourselves. This is not something that we should share with the British. And then there is reference to a report which Truman is so unusual and out of this world that Truman, there's only one copy of it. And there's no access to this agreement. And Truman says, Lilienthal records it, well, that agreement is staying in my safe and nobody is having access to it. Now, of course, we don't know what it is, but in the context of the discussion that we're having, it's very likely that it's something to do, I would say, with Majestic 12.
Now, John, put your lawyer hat on for me for a moment. I'm fascinated by the work that you've done. You've looked at the typography, the printing, the format, the watermarks, the terminology used, the corroboration from other diaries. In law, one of the ways we prove a document, you verify the provenance of a document, is by doing that kind of work. Can you explain the significance to you as somebody who's spent a large part of your career investigating corporate frauds, corporate misfeasance, criminal frauds? Just explain to me why that's significant in terms of evidence as a lawyer.
Well, obviously, the evidence that you examine, you are looking for corroboration, and you're looking also for inconsistencies. And if the more you look at other material, that material corroborates and supports what is in the original document, then of course the credence is massively increased. So I would look for the corroboration of other witnesses. I would look for other documents that would detract from the premise that I'm examining. And I, quite frankly, haven't found anything that does that. I have found one or two documents which are not original, don't purport to be original documents of the time, but which are typescript documents which were disclosed amongst the Majestic 12 material, which I do believe were forged. And one of them is a document, I think, involving or headed Truman and Congress. And it purports to be an account of Truman being called to give evidence at Congress in 1963 or 1964, where he's asked about MJ12. And he is embarrassed and gives various answers. Now, that clearly didn't happen because I've checked with the Eisenhower Library and he was never in Washington at that time. So there are documents, but not the kind of Majestic documents we're talking about, which are original, purport to be original documents. These are typescript documents which were distributed together with some of the original, what I say original Majestic documents, of which there were copies or originals of the 1940s or 1950s.
So a lot of the classic MJ12 documents came via a gentleman called Timothy Cooper, who was a US Marine Corps veteran, and his dad, interestingly enough, and I assume this is where we're guessing he perhaps obtained them, his dad ran the reproduction and graphics at Holloman Air Force Base and printed classified material. And you've obtained key new documents that were held by Ryan Wood, who's one of the keepers of the MJ12 archive. And I want to go through this in some detail because I think the documents that you're highlighting, they're interesting. And the second question I'm going to ask you in preparation is, why the hell haven't we seen these documents before? Why were they held back on? So let's go through the documents.
Yes.
What are the key new documents that you're talking about, and why do you attach significance to them?
Well, there's two, and there's a series of photographs. The reason I think we need to look at both separately. The two documents that are new came about because when I was in Washington about 2 years ago, I met with Ryan Wood, and I asked him whether he felt that Tim Cooper had handed over all of the Majestic documents to his father when his father visited him and obtained the original tranche. And it sounded to me as though it was rather haphazard, that there was a filing cabinet and that Robert Wood had taken the documents that he was offered, and there might be others in the Cooper household. So it was decided that Ryan would go back and visit Tim Cooper's house, who had not been very cooperative since, and has really withdrawn from the subject. But we thought it was worth a go. And Ryan did go back to the Cooper household. Unfortunately, Tim had died quite recently, but his son was there and agreed that Ryan could have access to his father's files. And amongst the files, we found two new documents that hadn't been disclosed before. And I think those are documents of significance. One of them is the document of the meeting at Blair House on the 14th of July, 1949, which is part of an annex to a Majestic 12 report. Another part of that annex had already been disclosed. That was paragraphs 9, I think, onwards. This is paragraphs 1 to 8, and this page had not been disclosed. And this is the page which talks about Truman wanting to share some of the Majestic material with his allies. And it goes on to talk about some other matters, for example, the risks of approaching craft and the number of casualties that had occurred with Air Force planes being shot down, and they should take a less hostile approach to these craft because we were losing planes and men. But I think the significance of the Blair House meeting is that there had been an agreement signed between the Americans and the British, which limited the production of atomic weapons immediately after the Second World War. And Truman and Eisenhower felt that the risk of these craft that were coming in numbers with an agenda that wasn't known might mean that we were facing imminent attack. And they wanted to increase the production of atomic weapons because they felt there might be a war that had to be fought in space, and they would have to deliver these weapons in or near to near space. But of course, the problem with the bombs at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was that they weighed 10,000 pounds, and they would need to find a method of miniaturizing the nuclear weapons for delivery in any war against the invaders, if this was the case. So the Blair House meeting was important from that point of view, because they'd have to tell the British if they were going to increase the production of atomic weapons. And the Canadians, of course, were also interested in this. And that, I think, led to the meeting with the British, and that's why they had to bring them in and discuss the plans for possible alien defense.
You know, it intrigues me because the implication behind that document, if it's real, and I suspect it is from what you reveal in your book, the implication is that there were certainly very senior public servants like Sir Henry Tizard who were being briefed into aspects of the program, what we call today the legacy program, what was called back then Majestic 12, if we accept these documents. It suggests that there are, and this is certainly my understanding, that there are senior public servants who are briefed in by the Americans, but that it's very rare for politicians to be briefed in. I've spoken to two former living Australian prime ministers, and they swear black and blue that they've never been read into anything relating to UAPs. And it's interesting because I've had conversations with one very senior intelligence mandarin here in Australia, and he's hinted very darkly that he does know something, but he can't talk about it. And I suspect those kind of backroom briefings are still going on, that the Americans feel a lot more comfortable sharing with permanent senior public servants than they do sharing with what they've pejoratively called temporary employees, elected politicians. Do you agree?
I totally agree. And I mean, temporary employees are exactly what they are. They're here and they're gone. And there's a very much greater trust for career in intelligence or military figures. And also, I think, quite frankly, they know a lot about these figures. And there's some people who are reaching positions of political height who they don't trust and who they feel will leak like a sieve. And therefore, this is a subject that is kept very much amongst those who are career officials.
One of the things
there's another document, by the way, which we should come back to at some stage, which the second document we found, and the other photographs concerning Majestic 12. But
before we move on from that first document, though, I was going to ask you, there was a claim in that first document, I think, that talked about the crashing of an NHI craft, the idea that there was an alien craft that was forced to land at the White Sands Proving Ground.
Yeah.
What's the detail on that?
Well, that's that. I'm afraid that's it. I don't have any more on that, and I'm hoping others will be able to take this research further. But that clearly is a statement that was recorded as having been discussed at that meeting, and it was in the context of that these craft are dangerous, and they should only be approached when their technology, even when they're on the ground, is not available to them. So I presume from that there had been some hostile encounters with craft that had landed.
And I was intrigued to see it also references the Mantell case, which is where a fighter pilot was flying, I think, a P-51 Mustang as high as possible, 20,000 feet, to try and intercept a metallic craft. And it's been dispelled and debunked over the years that he was merely chasing a cloud. The document suggests the Mantell case was indeed chasing a real non-human craft.
Yes, and that case was cited at the Blair House meeting because too many planes were being lost in close engagements with UAPs at the time, and the advice was that they should back off and not be threatening in too many close approaches.
Okay, so we've mentioned that there are two documents. Let's go to the second document.
So the second document is a letter from Richard Drain, who was secretary of the Intelligence Advisory Committee, to a man called James Ley, who was Secretary of the National Security Council. And it is dated late June 1953 and concerns advanced contact group meeting held at Holloman Air Force Base. And the purpose of the letter is to stress that all records of this advanced group meeting, advanced contact group meeting at Holloman should be kept secret. All film should be kept secret, and none of it was to be released to anybody without the permission of I believe it's James Ley or somebody equivalent to him, and that this documentation clearly was to be kept under lock and key and wasn't to be referred to.
It's fascinating. I think before I came on air with you, we were talking privately about the fact that Richard Drain's name is all over the latest tranche of UFO files. He's very prominently featured in the coverage from the 1953 decision after the Robertson panel to essentially debunk UFOs, like he played a principal role in the decision, the policy decision, to essentially play down the UFO subject and to use stigma and ridicule and taboo to try to disengage public interest, to stop the public from looking at the UFO subject. It fascinates me that Drain's also featured in this new MJ12 document.
Yes, and there's a number of names that keep appearing in these documents. Drain is one, James Ley is another, And James Lay actually appears in an earlier Majestic 12 document as having been one of the people that was consulted over Roswell and who supported the establishment of MJ12 as a separate intelligence unit. He also, interestingly, was recommended by John McCone, a later director of the CIA, for a Career Service Award. And this is from the CIA library documents, for services in relation to intelligent projects which had involved interagency efforts. And obviously one doesn't see from that recommendation precisely what interagency project he'd worked on. But it's very interesting that he was commended, and he figures prominently in MJ12 documents, as does somebody else, Robert Amory, who was the deputy director of intelligence at the CIA, who appears to have been writing presidential briefings at weekly intervals to supply to the White House. So these are names that keep recurring in the documentation, who seem to be very close to the intelligence in relation to the UAP phenomenon.
Now, let's put your legal hat back on again, because we're proving the provenance of these documents. And you've done some great work in verifying by, for example, separate diary entries and earlier documents to verify the provenance of this particular document. Take me through it. I understand, for example, Truman and Eisenhower's diaries had useful information to help you corroborate.
Yes. So the meeting itself is recorded in those diaries. It's an off-the-record meeting. It's recorded, as I said, also in David Lilienthal's diaries.
And forgive me for interrupting, John. The crucial point there is that at the time that these MJ12 documents were released, would the people who, let's assume for a moment they were crafted documents, that they were deviously crafted by some sly fellow who wanted to deceive the public, would they have had access to Truman and Eisenhower's diaries in the way that we do now?
I don't believe so, because these diaries have only been released in succeeding years and were not available. I'm sure somebody possibly in the Central Intelligence Agency might have been able to get special access to them, but they have not been available to the public and have been kept in pretty secure conditions.
So the point is that, let's assume just hypothetically for a moment they are bunkum. It would be the most elaborate hoax to go through and anticipate the detail of knowing what Eisenhower and Truman said in their diaries to make sure that everything you wrote was consistent in a document that was leaked in the 1980s.
Exactly. And it's the quantity of these documents, the detail in the documents, which can now be confirmed in many respects. And also there are documents amongst the MJ12 material which really don't have any particular counterintelligence benefit, which are routine exchanges of letters between people with an MJ12 stamp on. And there's no purpose in creating that kind of material. And you'd had to have had an army of people, really, who would have had to have had a vast amount of sources to put this material together. The detail is impressive, it's consistent, and as I say, it's confirmed by access to a range of public documents that are now available.
So your point is that this is significant new information. Do we have any explanation as to why Tim Cooper or Ryan Wood and his dad didn't use it previously? Were they just oblivious to it?
I don't think it just wasn't handed over. I think it was very much a question of getting what Tim Cooper was prepared to give them, and some of the material was left behind. And that was the purpose of my discussion with Ryan for going back to see what they could find. There's also, by the way, a quantity of photographs which were obtained, which have never properly been looked at. And I have looked at them and have selected what I think are some key ones. And one is an extraordinary photograph of what is a saucer-shaped craft with a number of chairs in front of it. And it very much a black and white photograph. I've got the original. It's a photograph which is consistent with photography or photograph that the kind you'd have in the 1940s or the 1950s. And it is either of a saucer-shaped craft being projected onto a screen and chairs in front of it, or of a craft behind a glass panel in a facility and chairs there for people to observe it. But it is, I can't vouch for its provenance, but it does look to me like a genuine photograph. Also amongst those photographs were photographs of a number of people with MJ12 on the back. And these were scientists, many of them paperclip scientists, who we know from other sources have worked for MJ12. And those are people like John von Neumann, Szilard, Edward Teller. And from other sources, we know that, for example, Dr. Eric Walker has spoken to other ufologists many years ago, William Steinman, to confirm that von Neumann actually was working at MJ12, and Eric Walker confirms he had worked at MJ12. We know also that others have confirmed who were working at that time on these projects that von Neumann was working on MJ12 projects. I did ring the von Neumann family and try to speak to von Neumann's wife, who's now quite elderly, and I couldn't really press her, I'm afraid, to confirm what her husband's work was 70 years ago.
I want to jump back for a moment to the earlier document that you mentioned, the so-called Advanced Contact Meeting at Holloman. The inference there is that there was some kind of contact with a UAP and its occupants, an alien spacecraft. Are you giving credence from that document to the idea that there was a secret meeting between the president and non-human beings at Holloman Air Force Base?
I'm not saying the president, but I'm certainly saying that there was a secret contact meeting, a contact group meeting at Holloman, and that this document confirms it. And there is a CIA reference number, obviously, on the document, for which can obviously others can look at. And that seems to have been confirmed because we know that Dr. Eric Davis has recently spoken about a conversation he had with President Bush Sr. And he says that Bush told him that when he became director of the CIA, he was briefed about a landing at Holloman, not with the president, but with a number of uniformed officers and CIA officers that had taken place, and that a non-human individual of Nordic appearance had emerged from a craft and had met with these individuals at Holloman. I have never been persuaded myself that any president has had a meeting, but I do believe that what Bush told Eric Davis is likely to be true. And I do believe that this document, because of the secrecy that was being imposed by Drain in the letter to Lay, is confirming that this was either a meeting or plans for a contact meeting, which was to be kept under very strict wraps, and that Alan Dulles had been consulted as well regarding the security of the contact group meeting and film, and that it simply was not to be released.
Now, I want to take you now to, I think, perhaps the most controversial area, but an area that I happily endorse as an area that is worthy of investigation, JFK and UFOs. And it intrigued me to see in your book so much material that I've raked over myself previously. You spoke with, and I know Dark Journalist in the past has done stories about this guy, Douglas Caddy, who was Howard Hunt's lawyer. So Watergate principal Howard Hunt had a lawyer called Douglas Caddy. Tell me the Douglas Caddy story, John.
Well, I mean, this actually is part of the story is quite well known. Douglas Caddy was a lawyer who was called by Howard Hunt at the time that the Watergate burglars, or just after the Watergate burglars had been discovered. And Hunt instructed him to represent both the burglars and himself. And Caddy, unfortunately, could not continue as the legal representative because he was cited for contempt by a judge for refusing to declare who had instructed him. But the interesting thing about what Douglas Caddy has said is that he had a dinner with Howard Hunt just before Howard Hunt was going to go to prison. And understandably, Douglas raised with Howard Hunt what had been the reason for going into Watergate. And Hunt reluctantly said, well, it was to do with some documents there that we believed that the Democrats had from the Cubans, which reflected on President Kennedy's assassination. Conversation stopped over dinner, but just before they parted on the sidewalk, as they were leaving, as Hunt was going off to prison and Caddy was turning in the other direction, he pressed his luck again and he said, well, why was Kennedy assassinated? And Hunt came out with the memorable phrase, because he was about to reveal the alien presence. Now, the interesting thing is that Hunt, you might say, well, how would he know? And why was he so involved? And what I've tried to do is to follow that through. And I think there is pretty conclusive evidence now that Howard Hunt and a man called Frank Sturgis were involved in the Kennedy assassination, and therefore that Hunt would have known what he was talking about and what the reason would have been for the order to assassinate Kennedy. And the evidence that I've highlighted is that, first of all, a lady called Marita Lorenz, who was the former mistress of Fidel Castro, gave a statement to one of the congressional committees that was looking at assassinations, in which she said that Frank Sturgis, a CIA contractor, was engaged in going to Dallas and was involved in the assassination of Kennedy, that Hunt had gone with them and had handed Sturgis an envelope, and that they were both involved. Sturgis found out about this, threatened to kill her, and a police officer from the 18th precinct, a man called Jim Rothstein, was sent to her flat to protect her. He arrested Sturgis, and Sturgis confessed to him that he in fact had been one of the gunmen on the grassy knoll and had been one of the gunmen who had shot Kennedy, and that Hunt had been involved. There's a bit more. Hunt's son also reports that his father had admitted to him that Sturgis had asked him to be involved in the assassination, but he told his son he declined. And in another final piece of evidence, this matter had been litigated before a jury when Hunt sued a newspaper called the Liberty Lobby. The jury had found against Hunt on the basis that he had been involved in the assassination, and so had the CIA. So there's a lot of evidence that Hunt knew what he was talking about, that the CIA was behind Kennedy's assassination, and when Hunt gave the reason that it was because he was about to reveal the alien presence, that Hunt knew what he was talking about.
You know, it's fascinating the way all this meshes together, John, because as you know, I'm a good friend with a guy here in Australia called Jeff Cruikshank, who's done some great work on David Lamar Christ, or Christ, I don't know how you say his name.
Researcher.
Very senior CIA scientist, Christ, and he was imprisoned in Cuba at around the time of the Bay of Pigs, and there was genuine concern inside the CIA that Christ would basically reveal what he knew. And the implication is that he was aware of the alien presence, as Howard Hunt alluded in his conversation with Douglas Caddy. And the thing I find fascinating is that the primary motivation for the Watergate burglary, the very thing that brought down Richard Nixon, might have been an attempt to conceal what they knew about penetration of the UFO secrets.
Yes.
It's breathtaking.
It is breathtaking. I should just add, by the way, that I did find and locate Jim Rothstein, the police officer to whom Jim Sturgis confessed, and he confirmed that Sturgis had admitted to shooting Kennedy. So,
this is what I wrestle with. We've done investigations ourselves here on Reality Check about the JFK case, and I get a lot of people still offering me information about it. To me, it's a cancer at the heart of the American body politic that you can have an unsolved murder of a president, and you can have the congressional committee that investigated the murder making it very clear that they believe there was a conspiracy. You believe that the CIA or people inside the CIA were involved in an effort to murder JFK because of the UFO secrets.
Yes, I believe, and a number of congressional committees have had. There's the Church Committee, there's the Rockefeller Commission, there's the Commission on Assassinations. All of them have looked at the question of whether there was CIA involvement in this. Some of them have suggested that there was. Some of them have been extremely dissatisfied with Alan Dulles' performance in relation to the Warren Commission. And I do believe, yes, that Frank Sturgis, a CIA contractor, confessed to Jim Rothstein that he was one of the gunmen. I believe that Hunt was involved, and I believe that Hunt's explanation for the reason is something that is very likely to be true, and that there is other evidence that Kennedy was interfering in the UFO situation, because he was very concerned that after the Bay of Pigs, that an UFO might be mistaken by the Russians or vice versa as an incoming ballistic missile. And he did not want that nuclear threat to exist. He wanted there to be greater cooperation, greater disclosure between America and Russia on the UAP phenomenon. And in fact, we know that in 1971, 8 years after Kennedy's death, an agreement was actually reached between those two countries, which recorded the fact that they would declare to each other if a UAP, in fact, had been seen and misidentified, because they did not want a nuclear incident. And there's a hotline between the two countries for those reports to be made.
I remember when I interviewed David Grusch in 2023, he pointed me to that particular document from the SALT talks, the 1971 agreement, and said that it was highly significant to him that that document had been declassified, and he couldn't quite believe that it was in the public domain and that he was able to talk about it, because it does. It specifically mentions UAPs.
Yep.
You literally have an agreement between the Russians, the Soviets, and the Americans that in the event of them, either of them, seeing a UAP, they would interdict in order to ensure that there was no misapprehension that it was one side attacking the other. And David couldn't quite believe that that document was in the public domain, but there it is. The full document can be seen in the National Security Archive.
And of course, Kennedy's wish that there should be greater cooperation over the serious UAP issues is something which would not have been welcome to the CIA, who'd been bent over backwards to denigrate this subject and to keep it under wraps. And the last thing they would have wanted would have been cooperation and sharing of information on UAPs.
Now, I don't want to go too much down the JFK rabbit hole, because I've done a lot of this in the past, but there is another document, a document that was purportedly retrieved from a burning fireplace. so-called Lancer document. Can you explain the significance of the Lancer document?
Yes, this is one of the documents which was leaked to amongst the Majestic 12 trove, and it's from a counterintelligence officer who worked under James Jesus Angleton, and who, after Angleton's death, was called in to go through Angleton's safes and to destroy a number of documents. And it's a fact, I think this is not disputed, that Angleton did not put into the CIA system many documents. He had his own safes, I think about 40 of them, many of which had to be blown open after his death. And this document was in one of those safes. And the instruction was to destroy it, to destroy any documents that were of this or other sensitive nature. And he actually literally pulled this from the flames, and in sending the document and disclosing it as part of the Majestic 12 trove, he said, look, this is the last piece of evidence that will tie the CIA into Kennedy's assassination. Now, I've actually looked at the original. I don't know if you have. I've examined the original of that document, and you've probably done the same, Ross. And it's watermarked. It has Majestic stamp on it. I know that's something that possibly could be recreated, but it's certainly appears to be a document of the time. I know that the Woods took it to a laboratory, the Speckin laboratory, who confirmed that the inks on it and the paper are of that period, and that the watermark is of government issue. So I think there's a prima facie case that it is a very real document.
Now, that document, let's go into the detail of it. It is chilling because it's an overt expression of intention by members of the alleged MJ-12 to murder the President of the United States. The President, Lancer, that was the code name, the Secret Service code name for JFK. Lancer is making inquiries which we cannot allow and suggesting action, quote, critical to the continuance of the group. The suggestion is that there may need to be an operation that is wet, i.e. CIA terminology for murdering somebody. I mean, when I first read that document, John, I have to admit, I thought this has got to be a fake because it's such an overt expression of what sounds like something out of a spy movie. You know, you're reading a classic Le Carre wet mission. You think it's genuine?
And I agree with you. I mean, I think that reading it is the kind of document you might see in a B movie. But I think the more you look at it in the context of what we've been discussing, the more credence I think it attracts. And I think prima facie, yes, I think it's a document that is worthy of very serious investigation and attention.
So let me be very clear about this, John, and I've asked you once already, and I think you've been very clear about it. What is your position on the implications from these purported MJ-12 documents? What do you think they show about the murder, the assassination of the President of the United States, John F. Kennedy? Do you believe that his murder, his assassination, was linked to the UFO subject?
I think there's a very strong argument that that is the case. Yes, I do believe that. And
wow.
You've also got to take into account that the CIA had a policy. It's a very different, I don't know if it's a very different organization today, but in those days, it had a policy of assassination. There was almost an assassination department within the CIA. It had got out of control. And that's why you get so many congressional committees, the Church Committee, the Rockefeller Commission, the Assassination Committee on Assassinations, looking at the CIA. They were looking at obviously assassinating foreign leaders, but they were also looking at assassinating people within the United States, which is highly illegal, obviously. I mean, and it's still a step further to consider that they're going to assassinate a president. But when you look at the other pieces of information that we've been discussing, yes, it does mount up to a serious case, I believe, that is, I think, stands up that it is highly likely that the CIA was behind the murder of President Kennedy, yes.
Wow, it's astonishing to hear somebody with your reputation as a barrister, very senior lawyer, making that assertion. One of the other things that leaps out at me, you've mentioned this, of course, already, but Sturgis, this person who allegedly confessed to New York Police Department Detective Jim Rothstein, he was a gunman on the grassy knoll. He was literally one of the triggermen, you believe, in the JFK assassination.
Well, that's what he told Rothstein.
And was there ever any kind of adequate FBI police investigation into the allegations that he confessed to Rothstein?
No. When he was taken back to the precinct, a CIA officer collected him from Rothstein's custody, and Rothstein was amazed that there was no further action in relation to what he'd been told.
This is the thing that shocks me about America, is it calls itself a democracy, but you literally have a situation where the CIA, by the way, the organization that JFK wanted to cast into 1,000 pieces, the CIA was able to pull a man who'd made a confession to the murder of the president out of a police detention and get him off scot-free.
It never progressed. And indeed, I mean, there should even have been, Sturgis should even have been prosecuted for his threats to kill Marita Lorenz, but those charges were never preferred. And of course, it's also interesting to note that a week after Kennedy's assassination, you get a very interesting article written by President Truman to the Washington Post, really not so President. It is a President Truman to the Washington Post, really being very critical of the CIA and saying, look, this is not the organization that I set up or what we believed it was going to be, and it's got completely out of hand. Now, he doesn't go into detail as to why he was saying that, and it may well be the case that he wasn't talking about, he didn't know or wasn't trying to allege that the CIA was behind Kennedy's assassination. But within 1 month of that occurring, he is writing, complaining that this organization is not the organization that it should be, and that it is a matter of extreme concern as to the way in which it is functioning.
Let's talk about Marilyn Monroe, who, of course, was the beautiful starlet who was having an affair with JFK, President Kennedy. What do you know about the murder, or should we say, let's be neutral here, the death of Marilyn Monroe?
Yes, I mean, this I want to say, I'm actually raising it just as a matter of worthy of investigation, and there's got to be an open question, but I think there are real issues here, and the real issue is because her death is so similar to the death of the journalist Dorothy Kilgallen. They were friends. Kilgallen had written stories in 1955 about crashed craft, and she'd been leaked by a senior figure in the British establishment. We didn't know who, that craft had crashed, biologics had been recovered, and that this was a matter of great secrecy. We know that, or understand that Kennedy knew about this, and he'd been told about it. He allegedly had told others about it, including Marilyn Monroe. And of course, there is this wiretap document, which has been released or leaked as well by two different CIA officers, one to Cooper and one to Stephen Greer. And that document is an account of a conversation on the phone between Kilgallen and another individual, and they're talking about Marilyn Monroe's dissatisfaction with the Kennedys and how she's about to leak secrets, even of his secret visit to an Air Force base where great secrets were being held. And the day after that document is dated, Monroe is found dead with an overdose of Nembutal and other barbiturates. It had not been digested, and the only medical conclusion was that it had either been injected or given by enema. And then some short time later, Kilgallen is saying, this was not suicide. This hasn't finished by a long chalk. I'm going to investigate it. And she began an investigation into Marilyn Monroe's death and into the Kennedy assassination. She herself is found then dead, lying on her bed with an overdose of Nembutal. Neither Monroe or Kilgallen had been prescribed Nembutal, by the way. And she was at the height of her career. She had just done an episode the night before of the television show What's My Line. She was very successful as a journalist. Makes no sense that Kilgallen would have killed herself. But both who had figured in this wiretap report die in very similar circumstances. And it just raises questions that call for some investigation.
So your point is you're not saying Marilyn Monroe or Dorothy Kilgallen were murdered by people trying to protect the secrets of JFK or UFOs, but it certainly should have been more fully investigated at the time.
That's what I'm saying. Yeah.
It is intriguing, isn't it? I mean, I find those stories, because I've read all this before, and I'm intrigued that things like that just come and go in the American body politic, and there's no momentum to get them further investigated. It's almost like there's a weariness about the JFK case. And yet, at the heart of it, it's a cancer right at the heart of the whole mystery of UFOs, from what you're suggesting.
Yes, and I mean, a lot of people say, they denigrate the fact that we're even looking at this or even making these suggestions. But when you drill down into them, there are some pretty hard evidence here, which is cumulative, and it builds into a pretty strong argument that you cannot ignore these facts, and they are crying out for further inquiry.
Okay, moving on, one of the other areas that you go into is the CIA's air warfare branch. And I'm not quite sure what you would point me to, but what would you say is new or insightful in what you go into on the CIA's air warfare branch?
This is whilst the mission centers are well known. So, for example, there are a number of mission centers in the CIA. This air warfare advisory branch is not something that is well known. People do not know what are the branches within the Central Intelligence Agency. But I have been told by more than one source that this branch exists and that it has been active in the denigration of the UFO phenomenon. And it has been doing what it can to ensure that it does not receive the attention it deserves.
So there was a great article written by my good friend Chris Sharp from Liberation Times over your way in the UK, and Matt Ford and others, that investigated the allegations of the involvement of an office called the Office of Global Access in the CIA. Do you give that story credence?
Yes. That's an office, it's been renamed now, which its purpose is to either drop people in places and other jurisdictions which are hostile, or to collect things from other jurisdictions which are hostile. And yes, I do believe that office has been responsible for obtaining craft in other jurisdictions. In the old days, they may have just gone in and taken it. and there are jurisdictions where that's happened. Today, I understand they're more likely to go in and negotiate and or to buy what they want. But I mean, two classic cases are Virginia, where we know that a craft crashed and beings, at least one being anyway, was survived, and that a aircraft from the United States came into Campinas Airport, collected the craft and the being. And there's another story to which I give great credence, with is the man called Jonathan Caplan, who describes a similar situation in Peru. And again, Kraft and the Department of Energy were on the scene, taking the taking the craft and the beings that were in that crash out of Peru back to the United States. So this happens, and one can see that the technological prizes are so huge that the Americans are prepared to go extraterritorially to recover what they can. And I expect sometimes, as with Brazil, probably they negotiated it. No doubt with Peru, they may well have negotiated it. But there are other jurisdictions where they can't, and they just go in and take it.
I was recently apprised of an incident that took place towards the end of the Cold War, when there was the beginning of a rapprochement between the Russians and the Americans, where an American astronaut was actually sent across to the Soviet Union to collaborate in a retrieval of a non-human craft. Stafford was the astronaut involved. And it's interesting because I noticed in your book, you mentioned that Bill Clinton, it became known in intelligence circles, that a craft had landed in the Russian Federation by arrangement. I'd never heard this story before. The implication being that a craft was deliberately landed. Is that the case?
Yes. I can't give the source for this because it would give more details, but I'm pretty confident that that is the case, and that information came back during the Clinton administration to the United States, and that this happened and was a real incident, yes.
Is the implication there that Bill Clinton, as president, was apprised of the knowledge of this incident?
My understanding is that is yes.
Now that's interesting because it might explain why Clinton allegedly was so interested. I know he did dispatch one of his attorneys, Webster Hubbell, a controversial fellow who was subsequently convicted for fraud. But I know President Clinton did take a very close interest in UAPs in his time as president, and he did ask questions about whether America had retrieved craft and didn't really get anywhere. And it's interesting because that might explain why Hillary Clinton, when she subsequently ran for the presidency, was so determined to try and get to the truth herself.
I think he probably knows more than he's let on.
I'm sure he does, sir. I'm sure he does. So overall, one of the most interesting admissions, and I noticed he's just come out this week with Uri Geller, one of the most interesting admissions that you highlight in your book is the claims of Haim Eshed, the former Israeli space agency boss, who very controversially gave an interview to an Israeli newspaper, Hebrew language newspaper, in which he made extraordinary allegations of a galactic federation, of recovered craft, of US collaboration in the recovery of and reverse engineering of non-human technology. Just this week, Haim Eshed appeared on video with my friend Uri Geller, who's appeared previously on this show. And Uri basically interviewed Haim about those claims. And Haim, it seemed a bit weird. I wasn't quite sure that I would feel 100% about Haim's mental capacities. But it verified what Haim asserted in a Hebrew language newspaper. And I was intrigued that you, like me, had tried to find out more in Israel and not had much luck.
I didn't. I mean, obviously, when that book came out, it provoked huge international interest. Although it's never been translated into English, I did get it translated from Hebrew. And what he was saying was that there's a group called the Galactic Federation. It's a group of NHIs who have our best interests at heart and who are in touch with the Americans and some other countries. and that they exist, aliens exist. But he goes on in the book, in fact, to talk about other crashes which aren't well known. And he talks about examining in great detail photographs that have come back from what we've landed on the Martian surface, and transmitted photographs, and how he can detect from some of those photographs artificial structures. So I did go to Israel. I tried to contact him. He wasn't speaking to anybody. I contacted the journalist who co-wrote the book with him. She told me that she wasn't allowed to speak about the book. So the initial feeling you get is, well, there must be something to this. They've been silenced. But I have to say that as time has gone on, I have no idea from where Chaim Eshed might have got the information which he is claiming. I spoke to Paul Hellyer when he was alive, the former Canadian Minister of Defence. He doubted the Galactic Federation story, actually, although, of course, he's confirmed that he was told that many races have visited Earth. And as time has gone on, because I don't think we can establish that Chaim Eshed has received this information officially, I think I'd have to say one should take it with a pinch of salt at the moment. He may well have been informed about some crashes, I don't know. Some of them have, which I've reported in the book, haven't appeared elsewhere, and they may well be genuine. He may have been informed about contact with other NHIs, but from where that information came, I've never been able to find out. And I think it's best to say that's his personal view rather than of information which he's been officially notified of.
John, you've spent many decades investigating the UAP mystery. Are you in any doubt at all that there is a non-human intelligence engaging with this planet?
No, none at all. And I think it's probably a the thing is, I'm not sure even the Americans or the Chinese or the Russians know exactly what the source of this phenomenon is. I suspect it's multi-source, and I suspect a part of it must be extraterrestrial, because life elsewhere in the universe is a mathematical certainty. But I think there's other forms of non-human intelligence which we do not understand. I think there's probably truth in or possibly some truth in the notion that there may be some kind of interactive collective consciousness which is interacting with us. But I think a lot of the answer to this phenomenon involves concepts which we don't understand, which we cannot appreciate, and it's going to be very difficult for us to resolve.
One of your forebears, British chap John Keel, had a theory that I've often liked, and it perhaps explains what people increasingly refer to as interdimensional or crypto-terrestrial. It's the idea that there's something that's always been here on this planet. It might explain the phenomena that we've called elves, goblins, and fairies, the kind of things that have been dismissed with a shrug and described as fantasy. But the idea that there is perhaps some kind of sentient life form that's sharing this planet with us. John Keel hypothesized that it was essentially projecting the UAP imagery, different representations of so-called non-human beings, essentially to cause a bit of mischief. Do you have a take on the John Keel take on things? Because it fascinates me.
I mean, I spoke to John once, and I met him once, and he was, I think, a frightened man at the time I spoke to him. And I think because he had encountered this phenomenon has become much more complex since I became involved in the 1970s. And I think it is now pretty much recognized, although whether we're talking about one phenomenon or more than one phenomena, I'm still not clear. But there's certainly a dark paranormal side to this. And some people refer to the hitchhiker effects of dark shapes or beings materializing in your home, orbs materializing or in the neighborhood. And I think there is something which the Catholic Church has experienced and has dealt with by purgatory and prayer over the years. So there may be an influence, whether it's benign or malign, it's not easy to say, which is part of our ecology, which exists or coexists with us, which is capable of interacting with us, and which may well have, at times, a dark side. I mean, the Quran speaks of the jinn, these smokeless beings that are capable of being malign or benign. So yes, I do believe that kind of intelligence exists or coexists with us. I also believe that there's extraterrestrial races that have visited us. So there's different forms of non-human intelligence. And I think Congress had a problem when they were trying to define in the recent act, which got nowhere for the disclosure of UAP documents, what non-human intelligence meant. And it means a variety of things because we simply don't know. And I think that leads on to another problem. I do not believe, as some do, that disclosure is coming through President Trump's.
Me neither.
I really don't. It raises too many problems. The problems it raises are, well, who are they? What's their agenda? Do they believe in God? And then you've got the intelligence community having to confess to a canon of sins which they've committed over the last 50 years, possibly, which I believe include physical assault and murder.
Murder of a president, no less.
Probably murder of a president. So the disclosure is not on the table. I think what we're going to get is President Trump's very keen to be a president that's doing things no other presidents have done. So some kind of disclosure is fine for him. But as far as the three-letter agencies are concerned, as long as you keep that to saying, well, all right, this video is anomalous or this craft is anomalous, that's fine. We'll live with an anomalous phenomenon, but we're not going any further. We are not going to hear about crash craft. We're not going to hear about legacy programs. We're not going to hear about biologics. All of that is off the table.
I completely agree with you. One thing I wanted to pick up on you with, it was interesting, one of the great reports into UAPs, interestingly enough, and it's often overlooked, was the Condign Report, the British Condign Report. And it looked at plasma as an explanation for the UAP mystery. And I was struck this week that David Grusch, in the presentation that he gave on the steps of the Congress, when he was asked by one reporter about the life forms that he was aware of, one of the things that he mentioned was sentient plasmoids. And it struck me, I'm aware also of ongoing research involving sentient plasmoids by a team that's working currently covertly. The Condign Report inferred pretty much the same thing, didn't it, 20, 30 years ago?
Yes. I think I think structured craft, if there's an ET source to that, is something they can understand, and which they may have. I think the thing that has always troubled the American intelligence services is orbs and plasma. And I don't think that is something that is understood. And my understanding is that there was an orb project which the CIA began, and that came out of observations of orbs which had been detected by advanced photographic platforms. And my understanding also is that there's been some cooperation between the Americans, the Russians, and the Chinese on detection of orbs. And there's been some sharing of information about that. I don't know how far it's gone.
Which is another reason why I'm also skeptical that we're going to see any kind of disclosure, big D disclosure, because it implies very strongly, David Grusch, for example, talked about agreements that he was able to talk about in his DOPSA. The idea that there are agreements, potentially either with foreign adversary powers about UAPs or perhaps even with NHI. And I surmise, I'm only speculating here, maybe there is something in those agreements that says that the human race isn't ready. Do you think we're ready, John?
For disclosure?
Yeah.
No. I don't, because I think the answers simply aren't there. And I think to disclose that the phenomenon is real, to disclose that we're not in control of our airspace or of our oceans, is something which would be so destabilizing that it's not really feasible.
Sadly, I think you're right. John Caplan KC, it's been an honour to speak with you. I could talk to you all night. I'd love to have you back on again sometime. It's a delight to meet you. Anyone who wants to know more about John Caplan's work on UAPs should buy his book, Not for Disclosure, UFOs, the World's Best Kept Secret. It's out with Penguin Publishers now in all good bookshops. Will you be touring the UK or Australia, John, on a book tour?
Well, yes, I'm willing to go anywhere and looking forward to doing so. And I think it's very important to get out and talk actually to people, meet people. And one of the points of the book is to have an informed debate. And there's so many intelligent people that are interested in this subject, but don't know where to go to access the material. And it's so fundamental that we do that. We involve academia. We spread information, reliable information, because it's in our interests, I think, to do so. And I will certainly participate as fully as I can.
Well, Jonathan Caplan, I don't know how you fitted in writing a book in the middle of your busy legal career, but thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with Reality Check, and we look forward to hearing more from you in the future. Thank you so much for joining us.
A great pleasure, Ross. Thank you so much.